We may have some people straggling in from downstairs, but I thought we'd go ahead and start the festivities this evening. My name is Sarah Cobb, and I am the director of the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And my job is ceremonial here this evening. I'd like to welcome you, all of you, to the 14th annual Lynch Lecture. This is a lecture that was initiated in honor by Ed and Helen Lynch in honor of their parents, Vernon and Minnie Lynch. And the intention at the time it was inaugurated was to provide an opportunity for the wisdom, intelligence, and general knowledge of the developing field of conflict resolution to be shared with ICAR community and its friends, circle of colleagues. So we're continuing in that tradition, and it's been a tradition of excellence. We have, there's a long line of wonderful speakers that have both prophetic comments to make as well as wise reflections. We recall last year Kevin Averick's admonitions and chastising us for our response to September 11. And we've had generally an opportunity to learn from these speakers. So we're going to continue in that tradition of excellence tonight, and I'm looking forward to very much to hearing from our speaker. And it's a difficult time for us to be coming together to do this. We're in the shadow of the war, in a political context where there's a lot of divisiveness and confusion and sometimes not opportunity and space for talking about these difficulties. So it's even more important tonight that we engage in this lecture, this opportunity for learning together in the context that we're currently in. I'd like to, before we get on with the ceremony, to recognize some of the folks that are here that have honored us with their presence. And I saw downstairs anyway, President and Mrs. Merton. Sally's here. Well, we thank you very much for coming and supporting us with your presence. Also, we have a group of people who've contributed not only intellectually but financially to ICAR, and I wanted to acknowledge the Rice family. Ed Rice is here this evening, and to let all of you know, in case you don't have the word yet, that the Rice family contributed an endowment to ICAR, and that for a position, a faculty position, and that position will begin in January. And the job of that faculty will be to anchor the intellectual development of Point of View, which was, Point of View is a slot of land, 120 acres on the Potomac, donated by the Lynch family. So we have this wonderful confluence of the Lynch Lecture tonight and the Rice family's contribution to support the donations and the vision that the Lynches have had all along. We also have with us tonight advisory board members, and I'd like them to stand up because I'm not sure who's here. We've got Ed, Stan, and we've got Les Shaney, we've got Ann Carr, we've got Alma Jadala, we've got Marianne Baker, we've got Chuck Jiggets, and I know that, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. We also have Mr. Barringer here, who is the former director, co-director, but certainly mover, shaker, and general visionary that is responsible for the development of ICAR. So I want to thank you for coming and appreciate it. And of course we have our cadre of students, wonderfully intelligent and interesting students, and our faculty here as well. So I'm looking forward to the community of learning here tonight. Now, prior to introducing our faculty who will introduce our speaker, we want to go ahead with the ceremony for the presentation of the Baha'i Award for Excellence. And this award will be presented by Vera Breton, who is the chairperson of the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'i of Greater Vienna. Farah?
Good evening. Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to be here tonight in representation of the Baha'i community of Greater Vienna to present this award for excellence. The Baha'i Award for Excellence has been sponsored by the Baha'i community of Greater Vienna since 1997. To honor a student at the Institute of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, whose values and work reflect the Baha'i ideals of peace and human brotherhood. For more than a century, Baha'i communities around the world have been working to break down barriers between peoples and have collaborated with other like-minded groups and institutions to promote the model of a global society. At the heart of our belief is the conviction that the humanity is a single people with a common destiny. In the words of Baha'u'llah, the founder of our faith, the earth is but one country and mankind is citizens. The recipient of this award is chosen by the faculty of the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. He or she must have consistently demonstrated dedication and enthusiasm in academic endeavors, commitment to service to the community, and commitment to nonviolent social change founded on moral and spiritual values and principles. Tonight, we present the Baha'i Award for Excellence to Orly Friedman. Commitment to peace and international understanding. Ms. Friedman holds degrees in political science and history of the Middle East from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and from Tel Aviv University. And she is currently a PhD candidate at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. She has worked as a facilitator for groups in conflict in the School for Peace in Ner Shalom Wahar al-Salam, and as a facilitator for dialogue groups between Israelis and Palestinians since 1994 to 2001. In the past 3 years, Ms. Friedman worked at the Seeds for Peace Center in Jerusalem as a facilitator for dialogues between teenagers from Israel, Palestine, Cyprus, and the former republics of Yugoslavia. It is a great honor to us to extend this award for excellence to Ms. Orly Friedman tonight.
Prior to introducing the faculty that will introduce our speaker, I'd like to also acknowledge our current Lynch Chair. Again, this is an endowed chair at ICAR, endowed by the Lynch family. And the current holder of the Lynch Chair is Professor Dan Truckman. So he's busy doing his research and contributing to the knowledge we have in the field of conflict resolution through his activities as the Lynch Chair. So that's just sort of part of the ceremony of celebrating the contributions of the Lynch family as we're thinking about them tonight in the context of this lecture. So let me now just briefly introduce Professor Rich Rubenstein, who will introduce our speaker. He is faculty at ICAR and has been that way for 15 years, 12, 15 years, long time, 16 years.
But who's counting?
Who's counting, right. He's a former director of ICAR. He is an author, a prolific writer, and he's currently interested in the relationship between religion and conflict, and I call to your attention his latest book Aristotle's Children, which is, we're all awaiting eagerly to roll off the presses. So, Rich.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. People in my position introducing a speaker often start out by saying it's a great pleasure. In this case, it actually is a great pleasure to introduce this speaker. I was privileged a few months ago to attend a conference in Chicago called the Transatlantic Conference on Racism and Xenophobia, with scholars and political figures, media representatives, and so forth, from both sides of the Atlantic in Chicago. That conference was organized by Buzz Palmer, who is one of my oldest friends, who was originally a student of mine at Roosevelt University and ended up a teacher of mine. And I would like, he produced that conference and he introduced me to Glyn, and I would like to recognize him this evening. This is Buzz Palmer. Glyn Ford is a member of the European Parliament. His constituency is 5 million people. It includes the people in southwest England and most recently the residents of Gibraltar as well. He has been in the European Parliament since 1984, where he has become one of the European Parliament's, or perhaps the European Parliament's leading expert on, among other things, racism and xenophobia. Glyn grew up in southwest England near the Welsh border, graduated from Reading University in 1972 with a Bachelor of Science, got a master's the next year at University College London in oceanography. And it's just a fine background, I'm sure you'll agree, for a politician and an expert in conflict resolution. And he's still interested in oceanography, at least to the extent of windsurfing. He was a windsurfer. After that, Glyn went to Manchester, where he studied science and technology policy. And in Manchester, following up his long-term political interests, became a Labour Party representative to the local government, with specializing in environment and education. At the same time in the UK, he was already interested in problems of race and social justice. He became a member of the Anti-Nazi League, of which he's still the treasurer, and set up a commission of inquiry on the causes of racism and anti-Semitism. At the European Parliament, Glyn has become the leader, really, of a group of European parliamentarians interested in racism and xenophobia. He is the secretary of the anti-racist group of the European Parliament. He did a great deal to bring into existence a European Parliament Commission on the causes of racism and xenophobia, and also to represent the European Parliament in the European Council of Ministers Consultative Commission on Racism and Xenophobia, and he was also a delegate to the UN World Conference on Racism. Glyn is a figure somewhat unfamiliar in the United States, of a politician who has scholarly capabilities and who writes books, who is profoundly committed to social justice, and keeps all this together, does all these things at the same time. He's written an important book called Fascist Europe, about the rise of the far right in Europe. He's written articles, he's written book reviews. Glyn is married also with 2 children, and commutes between the United Kingdom and his constituency there in Brussels, where the headquarters of the European Parliament are. I think it might be important to mention, since Glyn has kindly agreed, that in the questions section following his speech, he will answer questions about his lecture, but about other things that people may be interested in, given the state of the world today. Glyn is also the foreign affairs spokesman for the European Parliamentary Labour Party, and is the European Parliament's leading expert on North Korea. In fact, tomorrow he will be visiting the White House to talk about the American policy and European policy towards North Korea. I can hardly think, given what's the state of the world today, given our need for role models, people who are simultaneously interested in politics, scholarship, and social justice, given our hopes for a new dawn of peace and justice in a world that sees far too little of either at the moment. We're very happy, delighted, in fact, to welcome Glyn forward to this podium.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first visit to the George Mason University. I hope it's not the last. Currently, there's a rising tide of racism sweeping across the European Union. The far right, the fascists, the neo-Nazis are coming off the streets and into the town halls, into parliament, into coalitions and into cabinets. The Brussels-based European Jewish Information Centre's annual report, which was published last week, said that last year saw the worst outbreaks of racism since the Second World War in the European Union, with increases in race hate, violence across the member states. At the moment in the EU, currently, there is a racial attack every 90 seconds. There were more than 400 major anti-Semitic incidents in France alone in 2002. But of course, the problem is not limited to anti-Semitism. We've also seen rising Islamophobia following the tragic events of 9/11, the terrorism, and of course, the current situation in Iraq. We're seeing violence against refugees and asylum seekers across the European Union and beyond. What I want to do this evening is fundamentally four things. Firstly, to explain the current state of play at a European Union level in terms of the growth of racism and xenophobia. Secondly, to look at what are the causes and reasons behind its rise. Thirdly, to tell you about what the European Union is doing to try and combat it. And fourthly, to look how in the longer term we need to tackle the problem. But first, I give you three warnings. I think I'm the first Lynch lecturer who is not an academic. Well, I am an academic, but I don't think you want me to talk about science and technology policy, oceanography, or geology. So I know what an academic does, but I won't be doing it this evening. Second, it's not a very pleasant subject. As someone once said, we may have 100 flowers blooming, but amongst those are some rather nasty poisonous weeds, and someone's got to do the gardening. Also, the last point I think is important. It's not just over there. Very often there's a view that how interesting we have a lecture on how terrible things are in Europe. It's actually elsewhere as well, including in the United States. It would be presumptuous of a European to talk to a US audience about what are the problems in the United States. But as you were told, I was a participant in the Transatlantic Conference on Race, co-sponsored by the EU, the University of Illinois, and Howard University in the autumn last year. And I'm aware of some of the lessons we have to learn from both Europe and from the United States in this area. The former offence in the United States of driving while black has now been replaced by flying while brown. In Europe, there is a close correlation between racist incidents, racial harassment, racial violence, and racial murders, and the success of fascist, racist, and xenophobic parties and politicians. And so, as a practicing politician myself, I find one shorthand way of measuring the growing problem of racism and xenophobia in the European Union is to therefore look at the electoral successes of these parties. Of course, those that vote for them are not all neo-Nazis or extreme right-wing, but nevertheless you do reap what you sow in terms of the politicians you elect. The European Parliament has 626 members. The last European elections in 1999, 26 MPs from 7 neo-Nazi extreme right-wing parties, and their fellow travellers were elected. What I want to do is look around the European Union country by country, or at least some of the major countries that are involved. In France, we have the Front National, the National Front, led by Jean-Marie Le Pen. This party first burst onto the electoral scene in December 1983, and they did very well in a by-election in the far suburbs of Paris in Dreux. In June 1984, they got over 10% of the vote nationally and 11 members of the European Parliament. One of the reasons we established a committee of inquiry into the growth of racism and xenophobia was that Mr. Le Pen and his party had just arrived, accompanied by a small group of Italian neo-fascists and a solitary Greek apologist for the Colonel's regime. I suggested we establish a committee of inquiry to the British Labour delegation, who thought it was a good idea, and suggested it to the socialist group, who got the necessary signatures to establish only the second committee of inquiry in the European Parliament's history. Then the whole thing backed up and went into reverse, because it was the socialist group's suggestion. They said, you have to have the chairmanship. And they said to the British delegation, well, you suggested you have to have the chairmanship. And the British delegation said, well, it was your idea. You're the chairman of the European Parliament's Committee of Inquiry. I did get a letter from Mr. Le Pen at the time saying he would use all means possible to stop the work of the Committee of Inquiry, but we did manage to survive it all. Mr. Le Pen himself's politics probably can be summed up fairly simply. He's a former Pujadist deputy from the 1950s who had then an anti-Semitic reputation. He's personally accused of engaging in torture during the Algerian Civil War. He didn't order it, he did it. He described the Holocaust as a point of detail of history, although in fact he wants to go further than that. In a conversation that was reported in a French newspaper called Glyn, he believes the Holocaust didn't actually happen at all. He believes that the Americans built the gas chambers in the Buchenwald concentration camp after the war. He's been convicted of assaulting a Socialist Party candidate, and was actually banned from seeking elected office for a period of 2 years. Members of his party have murdered a Socialist Party election worker, have been convicted of murdering an immigrant. 4 members of his party blew themselves up when trying to bomb an anti-racist organisation in Toulon called SOS Racism. His deputy leader, Bruno Gollnisch, actually believes that the Anne Frank diaries are a forgery. And another of his deputies, a man called Bernard Anthony, actually had his ex-directory phone number found on somebody arrested for, if you want, setting fire to a cinema showing The Last Temptation of Christ. Despite all of this, they have 400 plus seats on local councils, and in southern France control 4 cities. Toulon, Orange, Marignane and Vitrolles are actually run by the Front National. As an example, in Vitrolles, they've carried out their policies. They've cut off all grants to multicultural and multi-ethnic organisations. They've filled the local security services, the town hall security services, with Front National members. They've introduced, for the benefit, I say in quotation marks, of the Jewish and Muslim community, pork back into the school meals. They've gone through the libraries, stripping out the books and periodicals they disagree with and substituting their own. And they've engaged in checkbook eugenics. If you have a white child in Vitrolles, you get a bounty of £500. In 1998, there was a split in the Front National. Mr. Le Pen's former deputy, Bruno Maigret, split to form a new party called the Mouvement National Républicain, National Republican Movement. And so in the 1999 European elections, they actually slipped in terms of vote down to 5.7% for Le Pen's party, giving him 5 MEPs, and 3.3% for Bruno Maigret's, meaning he didn't reach the 5% barrier, so was not elected. Yet Mr. Le Pen has rebounded from that, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. In last year's French presidential elections, Mr. Le Pen came second in the first round, knocking out the Socialist Party candidates and all the other candidates, with 18% of the vote. A further 2% from Mr. Maigret meant that more than 1 in 5 French men, mainly, and women voted for Mr. Le Pen despite that background. Of course, he was badly defeated in the second round of the elections, only maintaining his 18%. But nevertheless, to actually have someone like Mr. Le Pen and his party being the main challengers to President Jacques Chirac is something we must be concerned about. In Austria, we have Georg Haider's Freedom Party. In the general election before last, they got 27% of the vote, becoming the second party in Austria after the Socialist Party, and going into coalition with the Conservative Party in Austria. Mr. Haider believes that Hitler's employment policies were better than those of the Socialist government, refused to condemn a terrorist bombing that killed 4 travellers, 4 gypsies, when the deputy governor of the southern Austrian province of Carinthia actually, if you want, removed all of the privileges of the Slovene-speaking minority. In Austria, in Carinthia, there are a group of Austrians who don't speak German, they speak Slovenian. Mr. Haider's view is you're not a proper Austrian unless you speak German. So the dual language education provisions, dual language road signs, special grants were all abolished when he was the deputy governor of Carinthia. When Mr. Haider was taken into government, the European Parliament passed a resolution actually condemning Mr. Haider taking office and asking that we invoke Article 7 of the EU treaties that said that members of the European Union who did not respect democracy, human and civil rights could be suspended from membership. The result was that the European Commission and Council of Ministers actually set up a wise men's group to investigate the situation in Austria, who reported back after a period of months that while there were some concerns about what was being carried out in Austria, they didn't actually breach Article 7, although they did agree that they would maintain a close attention to what was actually going on in Austria. Of course, since then there have been splits within Mr. Haider's Freedom Party, and in the last election the vote collapsed to 10%. Though of course the People's Party, the Conservative Party in Austria, have kept them in the coalition. In Italy, we have the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the Italian social movement. I was once attacking Mr. Le Pen in the European Parliament for being a neo-fascist, and was interrupted by a member of the MSI who said, "You can't call him a neo-fascist, we're the real neo-fascists." The MSI has direct links to the Mussolini regime. Its founder in 1947 was Giorgio Almirante, the head of the office of the Minister of Propaganda in the Salo Republic, the one period of Italian fascism when anti-Semitism was rife and Italian Jews were sent to the gas chambers. Its more recent leader was Pino Rauti, linked to various terrorist organizations in Italy, engaged in some of the bombings in Bologna and elsewhere. And of course, we also see that they were linked in the European Parliament in the period 1984 to 89 with Jean-Marie Le Pen's group. Actually, they left in 1984 to 89. They left in 1989 when the German Republikaner party, an extreme right-wing party, was elected under the leadership of Franz Schoenhuber, because the Republikaner were rather bigger and were more attractive to Mr. Le Pen at the time, but they have rather extreme revanchist tendencies, claiming not only that Austria but that northern Italy should be part of Germany. So it made it rather difficult for, if you want the party to stay, the MSI to stay in the group. Their current leader, Gianfranco Fini, writing in Le Pen's Europe de Patrie, Europe of the Nations magazine, in 1998 was actually looking forward to working with Le Pen again. The Republicans were clearly not going to win any more seats. But of course, at the time, Mr. Berlusconi arrived on the electoral scene with the collapse of both the Socialist Party in Italy and the Christian Democrat Party. Mr. Berlusconi was looking for partners. What happened was that you saw that the MSI transformed itself into the Alleanza Nazionale. I'm all in favour of political conversions, and we all know them. And having 80,000 militants of the MSI overnight being converted to what is now described as a post-fascist party is an interesting phenomenon, and certainly no consolation to immigrants being attacked by Alleanza Nazionale thugs with baseball bats in the suburbs of Naples. In a survey in the 1990s of people at the Alleanza, well, the MSI's then national conference, 32% of them replied to a questionnaire saying that they believed that armed struggle was an acceptable way of promoting political change. Mr. Fini is now Deputy Prime Minister in Italy, one of 4 Alleanza Nazionale ministers in the current government. We also have in Italy the Northern League, the Lega Nord. Mr. Berlusconi's had an electoral pact with the Alleanza Nazionale in the south of Italy, where they're strongest, whereas in the north he has an electoral pact with the Lega Nord, led by Umberto Bossi, also now a minister. They're a xenophobic, not fascist party, but their politics can best be summed up by the fact they believe that southern Italians should go home. So you can imagine what their views are on refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. In Belgium, and everything in Belgium is divided linguistically into 2, into the French and into the Flemish. In the Flemish part of Belgium, we have the Vlaams Blok, a violently anti-Semitic party, with 2 members of the European Parliament, on the basis of 15% of the vote in the last European elections. Remember, that's 15% of only half the country, so effectively 30% of the vote. 12 members of Parliament, and they're the biggest single party in Antwerp, Belgium's second city, where they get more than 30% of the vote again. They've been kept out of power in Antwerp by a coalition ranging from the Conservatives to the Trotskyists. But now it looks as if in the local elections to follow in a couple of months, they're likely to take power again. In the French-speaking part of Belgium, you have the Front National Belge, that did get 7% of the vote at one stage. In Denmark, you have the Danish People's Party, not a classic fascist party, but a xenophobic one, supporting the coalition. And of course, in the Netherlands, we recently saw the emergence of Pim Fortuyn's list Pim Fortuyn, with a pro-gay but anti-Muslim program, getting 17% of the vote after he was assassinated by a Green activist just before the election. In the United Kingdom, my own country, we're seeing the emergence of an extreme right-wing party with electoral prospects, probably for the first time since the 1930s. The British National Party, which is the name of that party, in 1997 did rather well in the general election, but that success was hidden by the landslide victory for Tony Blair's Labour Party. At the time, Nick Griffin, a man who helped to rewrite the pamphlet "Did 6 Million Really Die?", actually said that the objective of the British National Party was to replace the Conservatives, so the opposition to Labour, in the inner city areas. It looks as though that might well happen. They have a strategy at the moment of using football hooligans and similar people to act as foot soldiers, promoting violence and confrontation in immigrant areas. When the backlash understandably occurs, and we have rioting like we've had in Burnley, in Oldham and in Bradford, they then scoop up the votes in the white penumbra around the immigrant areas. It looks as though, well, in 2002, they won their first seats in Burnley, won 3 seats. In Oldham, an area near Manchester that I used to represent at one stage, they got 26% of the vote, although they didn't win any seats. And since they've won by-elections in Blackburn and in Halifax. In the forthcoming elections, they are going to be standing in 220 seats. Will probably win 20 or 25 seats. Recently, Mr. Griffin distributed a video with a voiceover of the Oldham riots. He claimed it's been provided to the British National Party by senior police officers in Oldham. The trials of the Asians arrested during the riots are to start shortly, with the same police officers giving evidence against those Asians arrested. One would have expected that there would have been a demand by the police for an investigation. Instead, what's happened is they've taken out an injunction to ban the video from being shown, something I agree with, clearly will be prejudicial to the trials. They also have an injunction that it's not possible to report the claim that it was given to the British National Party by its senior police officers, and an injunction to not report the fact that there is an injunction. Now, I have parliamentary privilege, and I raised all of this in the European Parliament. But unfortunately, because of this series of injunctions, no newspaper, radio station or TV station in the United Kingdom is willing to report those facts. As I said, they're likely to gain seats in May. In Burnley, they may become the official opposition. They're likely may well win seats in Oldham, Blackburn, Halifax, Bradford, Sunderland, and in Stoke, where in recent mayoral elections they got 20% of the vote. More worrying in a way, rather than just winning local candidates, is that in 2004, if they maintain that momentum, they will have for the first time a seat in the European Parliament. That would be something that would change the nature, in my view, of British politics. What are the causes and reasons behind the growth of the extreme right in Europe? Firstly, let me say I don't believe there is a single cause. We're seeing an evolution of the parties. They're beginning to, if you will, popularise themselves. They're moving from fascist right to fascist light. The national revolutionaries, those who are willing to engage in political violence, are being replaced by right populists. But the electoral appeal is partly to those people that are unemployed, who actually feel that their future is threatened by immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, aided and abetted, at least in parts of Europe, by a rabid media who are prepared to, if you want, run these campaigns against particularly refugees and asylum seekers, against those that come from the Dar al-Islam in particular. There's also, I believe, because unemployment in the European Union is not as high as it's been in the past, an increasing support for these parties by a fear for the future, a fear of insecurity. Not those that are unemployed now, but those that think they might become unemployed in the future. The traditional employment security in private and public sectors is being undermined by the consequences of globalization and privatization. They actually are, if you want, susceptible to the campaigns of the extreme right wing. It's also partly encouraged by the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the end of and an erosion of class consciousness as traditional political alignments crumble. It's aided, certainly in the European Union, by, if you want, modern political and campaigning processes, as we alienate, abandon, if you want, large sections of the electorate. And we see, as a consequence, vanishing participation in electoral processes. The only people campaigning in the HLMs, the council housing estates of Marseille now, are the Front National. The Communist Party has virtually disappeared in France, and the Socialist Party is all clustered around Paris, as whether they get selected for a seat or not depends on the party leadership and not on the electorate. I'll give one illustration of the dangers, or if you want, the political processes that are taking place. In the 1997 general election in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party focused attention on 77 key seats. Seats we had to win to form to have a government with a reasonable majority. In each of those seats, we concentrated on 2,000 key voters. I was involved in the process in Rochdale. Each of those key voters, in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, was expected to have six contacts with the Labour Party, by letter, by telephone, or by door-to-door calling. But that means that we ignored over 30 million voters, concentrating on 150,000. Less than 0.1% of the electorate was important for the Labour Party, less than 1 in 200. The result, of course, is a collapse in turnout. I don't know whether you know the programme Big Brother. I think we may be called Survivor over here or something. Well, actually, more people voted for the Big Brother election as to who was going to be thrown out of the house than voted in the last local elections in the United Kingdom. So, of course, that creates an enormous political vacuum, which is being filled by third, fourth, and fifth parties. It's being filled by fascists, by fruitcakes, and by frauds. You elect Jesse Ventura. We elect in Hartlepool a monkey. Well, a man who campaigned dressed up in a monkey suit as the mascot of the local football team. The reason that they have a monkey as their mascot is that during the Napoleonic Wars, a French ship came aground off Hartlepool, and the people of Hartlepool found a monkey, thinking it was a Frenchman. They hung it. In Osaka, they've elected a comedian, and of course, we're now seeing in Britain the election of single-issue campaigners. We've elected at the last parliamentary elections an MP campaigning against the closure of a single hospital. In Japan, in a by-election recently, they elected a woman campaigning against her son's death from AIDS. Those aren't important issues, but rejecting in the process all of the traditional political parties. The other problem, of course, is when the poor don't vote, party policies don't neglect the poor. So we actually, if you want, continue to alienate them more and more. The other, I think probably the last problem, is what I think of as globalization. One of the difficulties we face is that throughout the European Union, when things are going well, we're actually told it's because of the government. When things are going badly, it's because of what's happening in the rest of the world. The reality, of course, is that for small and medium-sized nation states, like those that make up the European Union, and I'd include Germany in that, they do not have the ability. They've lost their hold on the levers of power. The only way we can do things is collectively rather than individually. But of course, no politician wants to ever admit that. It's kept a deep, dark secret from the electorate, and the consequences follow. What are we trying to do at a European level? We're trying to legislate, really a thing that politicians can do. We're trying to educate for the medium term, and of course we're trying to organise. I don't know how much you know about the European Parliament. I suspect some of you not very much, which would be true of some of my electorate as well. It's not a criticism of the United States. We have a Council of Ministers, which consists of the Prime Ministers of the 15 member states, that meet every 6 months in a council meeting. In between times, transport ministers meet, agricultural ministers meet, social affairs ministers meet. And the council actually lays down the political priorities for the coming 12, 18 months, 2 years. We then have a European Commission that consists of 20 commissioners, supposedly, if you want, no longer representing their member states and no longer representing their political parties that they come from, because most of them are former politicians. The 5 big states, the UK, France, Germany, Italy and Spain, have 2 commissioners, and the 10 small states have 1 each. Their job is to translate the wish list of the Council of Ministers into legislation, which is then referred to the European Parliament. Elected every 5 years by proportional representation. The last count are 183 different political parties in the European Parliament. My favourite member of the European Parliament is Mr. Van der Waal, who was elected on a platform being against television and women. They don't actually allow women to join their party. Sorry, I'm not a. That was a joke. I don't seriously support Mr. Van der Waal. But the legislation drafted by the European Commission goes to the European Parliament, and we have the ability to block that legislation in most areas now. and 80% of our amendments are therefore accepted in whole or part by the Commission. Because if they're not accepted, and we don't like it, we vote the legislation down. And of course it wouldn't be there unless the Prime Ministers of the 15 Member States were in favour of it. What are we trying to do in terms of combating? Within the Parliament itself, we try and isolate the extreme right. I mean, I try to make sure that we get the Christian Democrats on board wherever possible, to get the extreme right in a minority of one, if one might put it that way. The Council of Ministers consulted the Commission on Racism and Xenophobia, where you were told I served on as the European Parliament representative, proposed the establishment of a European monitoring centre, which is actually based in Vienna, whose job it is to monitor the growth of racism, xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And that's European Monitoring Centre produces an annual report on the current state of play of racism and xenophobia across the European Union, produces reports on how best to combat the rise of racism and how best to deal with it when it's there. Since the Amsterdam Treaty, we have a new Article 13. The Amsterdam Treaty was an amendment to the Treaty of Rome that came in 1999. And Article 13 enables the European Union for the first time to engage in the fight against racism and xenophobia. And we've already passed 3 pieces of legislation. One, a race action programme to actually provide financial resources for anti-racist activity. Secondly, we have a new directive, a vertical directive on race, i.e. outlawing discrimination on race in the workplace and in all other areas of society. That has to be implemented by all member states by the end of 2003. Article 13 actually talks about discrimination on the grounds of sex, which we've had for a long time, race, nationality, religion and sexual orientation. And we have a third, what we call horizontal directive, outlawing discrimination on any of those grounds in the workplace for any of those areas, whether it's race, nationality, religion, sexual orientation or sex. We're trying to promote the idea that all European Union residents, and I say residents with care, including the 4 million black Europeans and the 12 to 14 million third country nationals living in the European Union, should have the same rights and same duties, including the right to vote. At the moment it's effectively only in the United Kingdom where, if you want third country nationals, have the right to vote. It's not enough. We need new legislation. Some people think that after Article 13, the legislation we've got already is enough. I believe that we need to go a lot further. We have a number of issues. One is on an issue called Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is actually illegal in Germany and in Belgium. It's not in Spain and Denmark. And what we actually see are German neo-Nazis going across the border into Denmark, literally a few hundred yards, and producing Holocaust denial material in German, clearly for a German audience. We're not asking the Danes to change their legislation, but what we want is to have internal extradition laws such that at the moment, if you can commit a crime in Manchester, you're taken to London. We believe if you commit a crime in Copenhagen, you should be taken to Berlin. We're concerned about the issue of the internet and the use by extreme right-wing organisations of the internet. It's probably not something that will go down well with an American audience, but I believe it's illegal on paper. It should be illegal on the electronic media as well. And we have legislation that makes a number of things illegal on paper. We need to deal with the issue of the import into the European Union of computer games produced in Lincoln, Nebraska by Gary Lack and his NSDA PAO, which is the original title of the German Nazi Party. The AO is for the overseas branch. Like concentration camp manager. German school playgrounds, you can get concentration camp manager. It gives you a choice when you load it into your computer of niggers, Jews, Pakis or Gypsies. And the game is to kill 6 million. You take the gold from their teeth and whatever, use it to buy more gas, and when you've killed 6 million people, you've won. Also concerned about dealing with the race hate music phenomena. We have a ban, if I could put it that way, in the United Kingdom, just one example, called No Remorse, short for No Remorse for the Holocaust. Their last CD was called Barbecue in Rostock, celebrating the petrol bombing of an immigrant hostel in Rostock. The band is British. The CD was printed in Denmark and Sweden, and it's been sold in Germany and Spain. At the moment, it's very difficult with European legislation to actually, if you want, prosecute. We want to change the European law so they can be tracked down. Al Capone was actually caught for, as I understand it, for tax evasion. We believe we should be looking at a European Union level at looking at who's making the profits, and it's estimated that race hate music is generating hundreds of thousands of pounds of profit for the neo-Nazis and their organisation. We also need, apart from legislation, education. The problem is that in Europe the forgetting has started. World War II and the Holocaust is history now, not current affairs, for many of the younger generations. We need to make sure that we remember what happened in the past. Extreme right-wing parties are changing, evolving. They're still run by men with convictions, criminal convictions, but they're now standing back and putting up squeaky clean local candidates. They're moderating their public language. It's no longer, if you want a nigger neighbour, vote Labour. It's talking about pensioners before asylum seekers. They're using modern campaigning techniques, videos, telephone canvassing. And I think it's important that we reply in kind. Firstly, we need to expose what they really stand for, who they are, expose the world of hate that they represent. And the Anti-Nazi League, of which I'm the National Treasurer, does that by producing leaflets. For example, one in Oldham, where we revealed that the agent for the local BNP candidate had been convicted of gang rape. We should also be producing our own videos. We should do our own telephone canvassing, and one of the projects we've got on at the moment is to test some language to see which works best with the electorate in terms of getting the messages across. We must reconnect the communities black and white, because one of the problems is that in Halifax recently, where the BNP won a by-election, they did it on the basis of mobilising the people we ignore. When we go canvassing now for the Labour Party, anyone who's not voted in 3 consecutive elections is ignored. They got 1,000 people to come out and vote who hadn't voted ever, according to our records. You have to get to them where they really are. A lot of them, I mean certainly the foot soldiers are, if you want, recruited from amongst the football hooligans. And we have a campaign called Kick Racism Out of Football, where the anti-racist message is going into the football grounds. We must tackle them head on politically. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, some years ago, when he saw that his vote was hemorrhaging away towards the Front National, started to take it. He said that the people of France were ras de bol, fed up to the back teeth with the immigrants, their smell of their cooking and everything else. Of course, it only justified Mr. Le Pen. He then stepped even further to the right and then responded when he had a 50-point programme for dealing with immigrants, when it was criticised for being extreme, by saying what I was saying a couple of years ago is now being said by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. In a couple of years' time, we'll be seeing the same about my new policies. We've got to reject the numbers game. When the National Front say there are 3 million immigrants, we shouldn't be replying this by saying, actually, it's only 2. We need to talk about what they bring to society from the outside, in terms of widening our culture, music and food, creating jobs. Some of the largest employers in the United Kingdom are actually immigrants or the children of immigrants. We also have to do things at a global level. I was, as you were told, at the UN World Conference Against Racism in September 2001 as a delegate from the European Union when it was held in Durban. I have to say I was disappointed that this was another example of US unilateralism when the US walked out of the conference. We did manage, in the absence of the United States, to get an agreement that all members of the United Nations should have national action plans for combating racism in their own countries. And certainly the EU is linking aid and trade agreements to having those national action plans. But in terms of the overall fight against the growth of the extreme right, firstly, it's too important to have divisions amongst Democrats. One thing I remember from the 1970s, when I first got involved with the Anti-Nazi League, was we were combating a party at the time called the National Front that would attack physically meetings. And we actually had Jews stewarding Palestinian meetings and Palestinians stewarding Jewish meetings to prevent them from being attacked. It's the kind of thing we need to see again in the future. But we must remind ourselves where they're coming from. Le Pen says 3 million immigrants. Unemployed, 3 million immigrants too many. Most of the other extreme right-wing leaders in the European Union and outside have the same slogan with different numbers. I went to the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. There they have a slogan from the Austrian Nazi Party from the 1930s. It said 400,000 Jews, 400,000 unemployed, 400,000 Jews too many. We know what happened to the Jews. It's important that we legislate, educate, and organise to stop it happening again. Thank you.
Time and you'll manage it yourself. Right?
Okay.
You'll just pick the speaker's brain.
Whoever wants to ask a question. I'm slightly deaf, so speak loudly. It'll make it easier for me.
Yeah, I just have one question. Certainly here we read that religions, people's interest in religion has greatly declined in Europe. Do you think that any of this xenophobia or these changes are related to that, or do you think those are just two separate things?
In Europe, we tend to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then...
Yeah, but we have to make sure that we repeat the questions because there may be people...
well, the question was, is the decline of religion in Europe important in this process of people moving to the extreme right? I think it's certainly an element in the process. Although I have to say that some of the people concerned, Mr. Bernard Anthony, who I mentioned, is actually very closely involved with Archbishop Lefebvre, the dissident Catholic Archbishop. So some of them are actually involved with religious movements as well. But I think the loss of belief is generally, not only in religion, but also in, if you want, politics, is leading people to be much, to swish backwards and forwards electorally and whatever. They're no longer rooted in their communities. And the collapse of communities isn't helping, and nor is, if you want, the Thatcherite slogan that there's no such thing as society. I think it's part of the process, yes.
Mr. Ford, a great presentation. Thank you very much, sir. What do you think the implications might be for the entry of 10 new member states to the European Union by 2004, including Cyprus, Malta, the 3 Baltic states, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, etc.?
Well, I mean, one of the things, in order to enter the European Union, you have to respect human rights, you have to respect civic rights, and you have to be a democracy. And we've made it very clear that one of our concerns is, and I could have gone through some of them, is the growth of extreme right-wing parties in some of these countries as well. So we will be watching that with some care. As I say, we do have Article 7 in the European Union treaties that allow us to suspend a country from membership. We believe, and certainly if 1 or 2 of these parties actually took power, I believe that they would be suspended from membership of the European Union. We currently have a constitutional convention taking place under the chairmanship of, in fact, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, where they're looking at amending the European Union treaties again on the basis of the enlargement, because some of the things you can do with 15 people you can't do with 25 so easily. And one of the changes we're looking to see is to actually have something in between suspension and being a full member. Actually, if you want yellow card and red cards, if that means anything over here, warnings before you get sent off. But certainly it is a concern, because I mean, some of those countries, if you want, I'm not saying there's very much good about communism, but they did keep some of these tensions under control. One of the classic examples is former Yugoslavia, where if you want, once communist control went, you saw the enormous interlocking civil wars that emerged from those ethnic conflicts that are there.
In this country, we give a great, let's say, recognition to immigrants. Okay, I'm an immigrant to this country, and I lived in Europe for about 7 years, in Switzerland. And in this country, you know, you read in the paper, in academia and all that stuff, that everyone recognize and admire the success stories of immigrants. So this country is open for immigrants. They become, in a matter of maybe a couple of generations, as part of the mainstream, you can say. In Europe, it's not the case. The Turks have been in Germany for many years, for about 30, 40 years, and yet they are denied even citizenship, till maybe recently. So you have Turks who are in Germany for 2 or 3 generations, and they are not even assimilated into society. You have the North Africans in France, and the same thing in Italy. And you have the North African in Belgium and in Holland. And most of I travel to Europe quite often, and most of the attack now is directed against the North African and the Muslim and so forth, especially after September 11th. What can the European Union do, they say, to make the immigrant community assimilate or as part of society and not to be on the fringes of society? Here we give them, our Constitution gives them the right to be part of America. In Europe, they don't.
I mean, our argument, well, my argument is that all European Union residents should be treated exactly the same, i.e. you don't have to be a national. The European Parliament has taken the view, for example, that all third country nationals living in the European Union for a period of more than 5 years should have the right to vote.